In 2022, 274 million people are in need of humanitarian assistance and protection. Preventing, mitigating, and responding to humanitarian crises is a challenge. Can fiction and storytelling play a role? Can it raise awareness and motivate action to address the causes and consequences of humanitarian crises? My name is Ruth Mukwana, and I host the SAHA podcast, Stories and Humanitarian Action. Welcome to SAHA, Stories and Humanitarian Action. I have a great show for you today, but before I introduce my guest, I'd like to ask you to subscribe to my YouTube channel, like, comment, and share this video. My guest today is Aida Mengistu, who is the Deputy Head of the Interagency Standing Committee's Peer-to-Peer Support Project, which provides targeted support to humanitarian leaders in country operations. Prior to this role, she was Deputy Head of OCHA's Regional Office for Southern and East Africa, supporting humanitarian action in 25 countries across the region. Before this, she was a desk officer in OCHA's Operations and Advocacy Division in New York, supporting humanitarian operations in Sudan, South Sudan, Somalia, and Burundi. And before that, she worked with OCHA in Darfur in Sudan. Before joining OCHA, Aida worked as a senior program officer at the International Peace Institute, working with the African Union and Africa regional organizations to operationalize conflict, prevention, and response mechanisms. Aida is a graduate of the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy and a mother of 3 children. Welcome to the show, Aida.
Thank you very much, Ruth. Great to be here today.
And I'm glad, and I know you're very busy, so thank you so much for making time to speak with me.
Thank you, Ruth. I'm very excited.
Yeah. I didn't know that you had worked with the International Peace Institute, and I'm actually curious, and I'm sure others would be too. What does the International Peace Institute do?
So it's actually a sort of a think tank. It's based out of New York and primarily works with the UN and wants to really act as a place where UN officials, member states, civil society, NGOs have a space to really step away from their work and really, in a free space, analyze the context that they work in, really try to find solutions. And this is all supported mostly by academics. So it's a think tank, but also works with in Africa and Asia with institutions there, such as the African Union in Africa, but also ECOWAS, SADC, and other sub-regional organizations.
Right. And the ISCSC, the Interagency Standing Committee, and what is that body exactly?
So basically, the Interagency Standing Committee is a group of humanitarian organizations, so UN and international organizations that are really working together to respond to humanitarian disasters around the globe.
Right. And how did you end up? I mean, I know you and I have worked together. Actually, we are very close colleagues and friends. But how did you end up in the humanitarian aid sector?
It was actually a little bit by accident in a way, although this has always been something I wanted to do since I was a child. It's cliche, but when I was growing up, I was born, around where the big hunger, the famine in Ethiopia was happening in the 80s. I was born before that, but I really remember the 80s, beginning of 80s, where was unfolding, and remember seeing, humanitarian workers on TV and thinking, okay, that's I would like to help. And that I remember vividly. But fast forward a couple of years, and I was really working more on the academic research part of, the peace aspect of it, peace building, part of it, conflict resolution. and was working in Sudan in the resident coordinator's office, supporting these kind of efforts when the Darfur crisis unfolded. And the OCHA needed people to really support that effort. So I was, approached to support that, and that's where it started.
Right. And either in your current job or some of these many jobs you've done so far, what is it you find enjoying doing this work or fulfilling for you?
I think there's many aspects of the work that I enjoyed. I find that it's focused on the people, the most vulnerable, globally, that are suffering from situations that they don't necessarily create, conflict around them, climate, droughts and floods. And really, being part of the effort to support, to help them is deeply fulfilling, and that's obviously an obvious one. But I also get to work with incredible people. This sector really attracts people that are idealists, that are really, quite exceptional in a lot of ways. And so really learning from them and being part of that is another aspect. Also my, academic background is really understanding the reasons, behind these vulnerabilities, the risks, and trying to really understand what can be done and how to influence to support solutions around those things, and helping people that are affected in a better way.
Right. And you say, as an academic and interested in academics, and of course you with the International Peace Institute, you used to do research, and you just say you're interested in finding out what are the reasons behind these vulnerabilities. And can you just tell me a little bit, what are these reasons? What is driving humanitarian needs today?
Yeah, I mean, there are, compounding effects. It's not only one thing. Conflicts are a major driver of humanitarian needs, unfortunately, and continue to be so. And so that's a major one. Failure of development, really poverty, people being in situations that are incredibly vulnerable. So they get their coping mechanisms really get wiped out by climate shocks, economic shocks, any shock, and with the impact of climate change being so more and more drastic, intense, and more frequent, climate change is increasingly a key driver as well. We've seen COVID it being, having a devastating impact globally, and leading to humanitarian assistance, and all these factors in many contexts are just on top of each other. So they so it is quite complicated and quite devastating more and more.
Yeah. And in your view, what are some of the solutions?
Okay, $1 million question. I think, again, I think being aware of actually what are the fundamental reasons for these vulnerabilities and risks is incredibly important. And I think that's where my passion lies. And I think that's where the work you're doing is so fundamental. I think we're not there yet in terms of understanding. And I think having a really quite sophisticated and deep understanding of what's happening is so important. I think storytelling is one way of really getting us a sense of that, having empathy and understanding of why there are conflicts, happening in this world, what's driving the climate change, what are the factors that are driving that. I think that's very much an area that will help. The more we understand, the more we'll find solutions. I think that, yeah, that's important.
Yeah, and I'm going to come back to you on stories I know we'll be talking a bit later about homegoing and storytelling and empathy and all of that. I want to come back to you though, because I'm also fascinated about your own life and what you're doing. If you could think about one key professional achievement so far for you, what would that be?
Yeah, I think I should have anticipated the question. But just out of my head right now, I think just starting out in the sector in the Darfur, as a reporting officer, and I think I saw there how much of an impact actually my work can have. I was a reporting officer at the beginning of the Darfur humanitarian crisis back in 2003, and really saw how reporting on the facts, what's happening, and really focusing on the people, what they're experiencing through going out there, having those linkages with the operational partners in the field, and getting and the affected people, and putting that in words as much as possible in order to mobilize attention, both political but also kind of resources. I saw that in real time with my reports being picked up by media, more and more operational partners coming to the region to support. And so I thought that was one very real kind of impact that I saw. I think that has propelled me and inspired me and motivated me to continue to do that, to really focus on the people and what I could do as an individual to support. And in the current role, and my current role is really at the global level, but mobilizing the senior experienced colleagues from the global level to deploy to the country level, and working with leadership at the country level to find solutions to concrete challenges on the ground. That's basically what the project does, and that I find very fulfilling, and there's a lot that can be accomplished through that peer-to-peer interaction. So I think there's not one moment I can point to. I think it's a regular thing that keeps me going.
Right. And if you could think about one challenge for you, what would that be? And the reason I ask this, I find myself as a humanitarian worker myself, we have both professional and personal challenges, sometimes extremely difficult, but we keep going. And so I'm always also curious to understand what those challenges are and what keeps humanitarian workers going.
Yeah, I think, big challenge for me is that, it's very easy to be overwhelmed with what's going on in the world. I think particularly now with, misinformation, kind of the social media and others adding to kind of an atmosphere of people being polarized and information being lost, and not being able to really discuss and try to understand where what grievances or issues could be, or even that's in terms of conflict, but also climate, and really trying to understand. And there's that misinformation, and in addition to just the sheer scale of the problems and the drivers of the humanitarian needs. I think that you can be overwhelmed by that.
Right.
So the challenge is very much. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, and I'm sorry for also interrupting you, but then how do you deal with that? Because I feel almost every day it never seems to get better. very few humanitarian crises have ended. Many of them are protracted, and then we get new ones. So that sense of being overwhelmed, of being overworked, is always there for so many. So how do you deal with that? How do you cope with that?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think personally, it's really, again, part of it is trying to focus again to what individually I can do, with the focus on, um, helping the people that are needing the support, and really focusing on that, a lot. But I think personal care is really important. I think making sure that, your well-being is important, to make sure that that doesn't affect that, so that you can keep going. I think there's quite a few efforts or trends that are happening in the sector that are quite encouraging, particularly a renewed focus on what affected people themselves and local organizations, community-based organizations can do, or are able to do, and how the international community could could support and empower them to be part of the response, something that wasn't as much of a focus a couple of years back. I think that really keeps me going and inspires me and motivates me to do better, and to support those kind of initiatives. So yeah.
No, and I just want to say, I know when we worked together when you were on the Horn of Africa and Somalia, and I was on Sudan and South Sudan, my whole recollection from back then was how efficient and effective you were. I remember, we used to go like, oh my goodness, she's so efficient. She's able to get everything done, and which I imagine helps.
Oh, that's super sweet. I thank you for that. I think one thing, and you are a mother too. I think that being a mother helps, I think, as well in terms of the efficiency part, and to kind of because you have that responsibility as well, and I think part of what keeps me going actually is also my role as a mother, in terms of setting a little bit of an example as well. I mean, and to my kids, in terms of there are things that you could do as an individual to make change, affect change in this world, how small it is, but and really being able to just explain that constantly, because our work is quite difficult. It involves travel and hours, and you have to constantly explain to the family, the kids, what you're doing. And I think that keeps me going to kind of make sure that they're also able to, at some point, hopefully be part of solutions as well.
Yeah, and that's so amazing that you say that, talking to your children about work. And I may come back to you towards the end about work-life balance and juggling motherhood and an extremely busy job. But I want us to go back now to talking about storytelling and fiction. And the premise of this conversation is really trying to see, does fiction have a role in raising awareness and motivating action to address the causes and consequences of humanitarian crisis? And so my first question to you is, do you think there's a role for fiction, for storytelling, to teach and even to motivate and raise action? And if yes, what is that role?
Absolutely. I think storytelling is incredibly essential. I think just going back to, trying to find solutions. I mean, in terms, it is really important to understand, what are the motivations, what are, some of the concerns, the day-to-day life of people being caught up in these difficult situations. And, with fiction, you can incorporate that in the stories in a way that is more, palpable in terms of and related more to your own kind of context, and try to understand a bit, and have a little bit more compassion, empathy, understanding of people's situation, and really also try to imagine yourself in that situation by getting lost in these stories. So I think that's incredibly powerful, and I see, more and more authors, especially from places, where there are, really quite significant humanitarian crises that are, affected by high levels of poverty, people from those regions that are understand communities and are able to develop stories, fiction, but based on, people that are there. Is a way to communicate to the rest of the world what is happening, what are some of the concerns, and things that are important in these communities.
Right. And we are going to talk about Homegoing by Iyasa Gassi. And it's such an incredible book. Myself, I read it, and I actually been wanting to read it. I did want to read it again as I was preparing to speak with you, but I wasn't able to do so. But what is this book about? And let's start with that. What is this book about?
Yeah. So, like you, I had read it, some time back. And when you asked me about, can you think of a book where, that had an impact on you in terms of what storytelling could do to impact change, I immediately thought of this book. Although, the details of it, I didn't quite remember as much, but I think it did have an impact on me, because it really was, it is about slavery. It basically talks about a family over 300 years, generations, and basically it starts with one woman that was sold to slavery, and her sister that stayed on and married basically a person that in the community that was selling, basically was involved in the slave trade, and basically tells the story over generations of the two different basically strands of the family. And so through the story, it talks about, slavery, colonialism, and the impacts that has, over generations. And I think one of the things that were incredibly powerful with the book is the vivid way, for instance, slavery was described. You felt basically, almost that you were there. It's very graphic. It's very hard to read some parts, but I thought, wow, it is very powerful. And I had wished that many people read it to just get an understanding in order to propel some kind of action, and really, or more, just motivation to understand a bit more, and to learn a bit more about it.
Yeah. And I like that. I think maybe it's now 3 or 4 times that you really say, understanding of what people were going through, and through that understanding, perhaps having also empathy and compassion for these people. And Yasagasi, of course, does it through these characters. You're right. It's very violent. There are moments where it's very difficult to read. But at the same time, I also felt like there's so many other themes as well that drive it. There's, love and family, dignity as well. Sort of these kinds of human connections that in many ways perhaps also help us understand. But I also liked, I don't know if you remember, to talk a little bit about this, I also liked a lot how she portrayed life in Ghana before all of this
That's right.
happened, their cultures and what these communities. I don't know if you remember any of that to speak to it.
Yes, I do, but I don't remember it as vividly as the other parts.
Yeah.
And now that you
Yeah.
say it, I do remember that definitely was part of the story, and that also part was, very detailed, very very compelling in terms of just trying to put the reader there in that place. I think, when you talked about, portraying a community before this something happened, I'm going to be daring and talk about another book, if that's okay, Ruth.
Yeah. Yeah, of
And
course.
so another book that I was thinking about is the How Beautiful We Were, by
Hmm.
that was I forget the author now, Mbwe.
Umbuwe.
Yeah, that's right. And similar book in the sense that it is over generations as well, and it tells the story of a community that has been impacted by the coming of a multinational company that is
Hmm.
extracting uh, natural resources, and how it's really impacted the social fabric, but also the environment
Hmm.
of that community. And it's told over generations. And so
Right.
I thought that was also powerful, because it did kind of, as Homegoing did, is really, portray, the community before this happened, and what the impact that has had over time. This interruption, basically.
Right.
And that's another book that talks most, on the climate part, really
Right.
driving some not only humanitarian needs, but also social kind of challenges that
Hmm.
were not there before, or
Yeah.
development challenges
And
as well. Yeah.
yeah, and I'm glad, I mean, you mentioned, and actually you gave it to me as a gift, and I'm gonna read
Yeah.
it. It's actually really on my on my
There.
coffee table.
Now you have to.
Uh, yes, I'm going to read it. But one thing as you were speaking, I was thinking about is because, for humanitarian work, something happens, whether it's conflict starts or climate change or a natural disaster. And then, of course, you have the communities who have been living there. But in terms of foreigners who come into these places, we really don't know. We don't know that history. And one of the things I really appreciate about these books in many ways is trying to, I think the stories often go back way before we arrive, at least foreigners, and the communities are there. Of course, we have challenges around language. I know you were talking about one of the things that you enjoy or that drives you is this engagement with local organizations. And again, I'm just curious, do you see any role when it comes to fiction or storytelling to help us to really understand all of that, but also engage with the people that we are there to serve or to help?
Yeah, definitely. I think um, fiction and storytelling, by kind of inspiring, kind of compelling us to know more, to be more empathetic. Um, I think does, and also exposing us perhaps to different
Mm.
perspectives, different realities. And just, it does kind of, I think it plays an important role, and in kind of further motivating us to engage with more meaningfully or deeply with local organizations, affected communities, because the fictional storytelling does give you perhaps a
Yeah.
sense, and to like investigate a bit more, and dig deeper about where the
Right.
communities are from, what's their story, how is this impacting them, and asking questions in order to be as helpful as possible, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. And going back to homegoing, I just took a few notes for myself, of course, to also speak with you. But there was something about how these communities were fractured as well. In fact, I look at like the Asante people were traders, and then they ended up starting to collect captives. The Fante were the middlemen who would sell them to the British or the Dutch. And it really came back to whoever was for them paying the most price at the time. But this really, trading and kidnapping and selling humans, and then sometimes then families having to disfigure their children so that they would not be captured. And then, of course, the trauma of it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And again, I think you picked up on, why it was so powerful and compelling, this book, because
Yeah.
it really doesn't, it prevents you from painting the whole thing as black and white, there, and in many contexts, um, you have to dig deeper, and it's really nuanced, and there are many different uh, you know um, factors that play out to then lead to a situation. And I think that's where, again, coming back to the importance of having the sophisticated understanding
Mm-hmm.
of why it that we're
Mm-hmm.
faced with these crises, these conflicts,
Mm-hmm.
and this more and more humanitarian needs popping up. And if we have that kind of more nuanced, sophisticated analysis of where things have been coming, who is who, what's happening, then it's a good start to then have develop solutions by really addressing those issues, and that actually go through generations. I mean, they do affect
Mm-hmm.
generations. It's not as if they get erased. This it
Yeah.
comes through, and I think we're lacking that a little bit today.
Yeah.
And storytelling plays a big role in terms of perhaps filling that void.
Right. And again, I mean, I think you mentioned there as well that resonates with me, and in many ways, why I really tend to talk a lot about war and conflict and violence. I think to me, what you say about the generational impact, it's really, you have a war, it affects an entire generation. The trauma continues on through people's lives and also impacts their own families. So there's that, I think, that perhaps we don't talk enough about. It's not a one day, even if the war ends, it continues to impact people's life for generations to come.
Yes, absolutely. And that's the heartbreaking thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because you see new wars now, coming up, and that, uh, you know, um, working in areas affected and with people affected by war, that it takes generations and
Yeah.
generations before, um, you know, the trauma starts to get even addressed. So adding new trauma, which will affect
Right.
now future generations. And I think, again, storytelling plays a big role, hopefully, maybe to prevent, conflicts. Because the more there is awareness that this is something that affects, and that has a very long term effect.
Yeah.
That could play a role as well.
No, and you're right. And when I spoke to Maza about her book, I think one of the things she
Shadow
really
King.
said, yes,
Mm.
The Shadow King, yeah, which is another incredible book. One of the things she did say was, it's also stories to help us understand the price of war and perhaps why we should avoid it and prevent it at all costs. You know.
Yeah, exactly. No, no.
Yeah. Ida, we are gonna slowly make our way to the end of our conversation. One thing I like to ask humanitarian workers, because again, we're talking about stories and storytelling. I find that almost every humanitarian worker I know has a story or situation that has stayed with them, in their work. And what is that story for you?
Again, Ruth, it's difficult to pinpoint it because I think every humanitarian, response, every interaction with people that are affected are suffering at that level, particularly when with conflict affected by, but also devastating floods and droughts. It does stay with you. But if I have to pick, I think I'm from Ethiopia, and my country just is going through difficult times. And I think seeing and supporting that, and as you say, the knowing that war and its impact and how it has, knowing, personally that this takes generations to address, but also seeing how as just a global community we're not able to really reflect on what is the triggering, what happened, and really not being sophisticated enough, and how that impacts the solutions then we try to engage in. I think that's heartbreaking, because I think ideally if more and more we using storytelling, being very aware and intentional about really understanding where everybody's coming from, including going back to history and understanding, and then for after that, really trying to address concerns or preventing wars from happening from the beginning, and catching tensions before they get to that point. I think, it's been devastating to see that. But again, I think each suffering, each situation that we have seen suffering has made an impact in different ways.
Right. And my last question for you is, if you think about anyone who will listen to this conversation, if they had one action to take to address the causes and consequences of humanitarian crisis, what would that one action be for you?
I think I'm going to sound like a broken record, but I think that's the point. I think the action, and I think that we don't do that enough, is to really, read and really understand, that context, read the history, read, whether it's fiction or just engage with people from that context, from communities from that area, to really understand what's happening before really starting to help, or try as much as possible to understand in order to be helpful.
Thank you. And thank you, Aida. That was my last question for you. Do you have any questions for me?
No, thank you so much, Ruth. It's great speaking to you as always.
Thank you. Thank you for your time. Thank you for listening to this conversation today. I hope that you have found it interesting. And if you have, please subscribe to my YouTube channel, Saha Stories and Humanitarian Action, and share, comment, and like this video. I'd like to thank Jamal Swift, my co-producer, and Nomadic Band for the music. Thank you. Goodbye.